My sister-in-law stood up in the middle of our family reunion, smiling like she had been waiting her whole life for that moment, and said she had proof that I had been lying to everyone for months, and I still remember the exact way the room shifted, the soft clink of a glass stopping midair, my mother-in-law lowering her eyes, my husband going completely still beside me, and for a few seconds no one spoke, no one moved, and it felt like I had already lost before I even opened my mouth. But they didn't know what I had been quietly collecting for months, and they definitely didn't expect what would happen next. And if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from along with your local time, because I always read every single one. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and that night was the moment everything in my family finally broke apart and revealed what had been hidden all along. But to understand why she stood up like that, you have to go back to where it really started. Because things didn't suddenly fall apart, they built slowly, quietly, in ways most people wouldn't notice at first. Our family reunion was held at my in-laws' house just outside Denver, a large 2-story home with a long wooden dining table that could fit at least 12 people, the kind of place where everything looked perfect from the outside, warm lighting, clean floors, laughter echoing through the rooms, but underneath that, there was always something else, something tight, something unspoken. Vanessa had always been like that, my husband, Daniel's older brother's wife, always polite on the surface, always smiling just a little too long, but her words never quite matched her tone. She would compliment you and somehow make you feel smaller at the same time, like when she once looked at my dress and said, "Oh, that's actually really cute for something so simple." And everyone laughed lightly, like it was harmless, but I felt it. I always felt it, and over the years it became clearer. She didn't like me, not in an obvious way, not in a way you could point to and say this is wrong, but in a slow, steady way that made you question yourself. And Daniel used to tell me I was overthinking, that Vanessa was just like that. But I started noticing patterns, small things, missing details, conversations that didn't quite add up. And then there were the messages, not sent to me, but about me, things I wasn't supposed to see, things I only found by accident one afternoon when Daniel left his tablet open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just trying to check a recipe, but a notification popped up, Vanessa's name, and a sentence that made my stomach drop. She has no idea what's coming. I didn't say anything that day. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even tell Daniel, because something told me I needed to wait, to watch, to understand what she was actually planning. And over the next few weeks, more things surfaced, little inconsistencies. Times she would ask oddly specific questions about my schedule, my finances, even my personal conversations, like she was building something piece by piece. And that's when I started saving everything. Screenshots, timestamps, voice memos, anything that felt even slightly off. I didn't know exactly what she was going to do. I never imagined she would choose a moment like that, a full family gathering, everyone there, both sides, grandparents, siblings, even distant relatives who only showed up once a year, and she waited until dessert was served, until everyone was relaxed, laughing, comfortable, and then she stood up, slowly, deliberately, like she had rehearsed it. She placed her hand lightly on the back of her chair, smiled, and said, "I think it's time everyone here knows the truth about Emily." And just like that, the entire room shifted. Conversations stopped. Forks hovered in midair. Someone's chair creaked softly as they turned to look at me, and I could feel every eye in that room settle on me at once, heavy, expectant, and for a brief second, I did nothing. I didn't defend myself. I didn't interrupt her. I just sat there, hands resting on my lap, heart beating steady, because this was the moment I had been waiting for. Even if they all thought I was about to be exposed, even if Daniel didn't reach for my hand, even if my mother-in-law avoided looking at me, even if the entire room was already leaning toward her side, I needed her to keep going, to say everything she had prepared, to believe she was in control. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every step she had taken to try to tear me down had already been documented, already been saved. And as she took a breath and reached into her bag to pull out what she thought would destroy me, I realized something very clearly. This wasn't just her moment. This was mine too, and I wasn't going to waste it. Vanessa's fingers were steady as she pulled a slim envelope out of her bag, And I remember noticing that detail more than anything else. Not her voice, not the way people were already leaning forward in their chairs, but how calm she looked, like she had practiced this exact movement in front of a mirror, and then she glanced around the table, making eye contact with each person one by one, almost like she was gathering allies before she even spoke again. And when she finally did, her tone was soft, controlled, almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. She said she did not want to ruin the evening, but she could not stay silent anymore. And that was when she placed the envelope down on the table in front of her and slowly opened it, pulling out a few printed pages, and I could feel the shift becoming heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. Daniel still had not moved, his hand resting near his glass but not touching it, his eyes fixed somewhere between Vanessa and me, like he was waiting for something but did not know what. And my mother-in-law finally looked up, her expression uncertain, like she wanted to believe Vanessa but was not fully sure yet. And that was exactly the moment Vanessa started reading. She said she had discovered that I had been hiding financial information from the family, that I had been moving money without telling anyone, that I had created accounts that Daniel did not even know existed, and each sentence landed slowly, carefully, like she had chosen every word to sound believable, to sound reasonable, and I could hear small reactions around the table. A quiet exhale, someone shifting in their seat, a fork being set down a little too loudly, and then she held up one of the printed pages, saying these were records, proof, something she had taken time to gather because she cared about the family and could not watch it be taken advantage of. And for a second, I almost smiled, not because any of it was funny, but because she had followed the exact path I thought she would, every step, every claim, even the order of how she presented it. It was all familiar. And that was when I realized she had fully committed. There was no hesitation left in her. No holding back. She believed this was the moment she would finally win, and the room responded exactly how she expected. My father-in-law leaned forward, his voice low as he asked if this was true. My mother-in-law looked at Daniel now, waiting for him to say something, anything, and Daniel finally turned to me, his expression unreadable, and asked quietly, "Emily, is there something you need to explain?" And I felt that question settle in the space between us, heavier than anything Vanessa had said, because it was not just doubt, it was distance. And for a brief second, I let that silence stretch. I let the weight of it fill the room, because I needed them to feel it. I needed Vanessa to feel safe in it, to think she had already pulled everyone to her side, and she did not disappoint. She stepped closer to the table, placing another page down, pointing to specific lines, explaining numbers, timelines, all of it carefully framed to look suspicious. And people nodded, slowly, uncertain but leaning, always leaning, and I could see it in their eyes, that subtle shift, that moment when curiosity starts turning into belief. And that was the most dangerous part, not the accusation itself, but how easily it could become truth if no one challenged it. And still I did not interrupt, I did not defend, I just watched her. Watch the confidence build in her posture, the way her shoulders relaxed slightly as she realized no one was stopping her, and then she said something that changed the tone completely. She said she had even found messages, conversations that suggested I knew exactly what I was doing and had planned it, and when she said that, a few people actually looked away from me, like they had already decided, like they did not want to meet my eyes anymore. And that was the moment I had been waiting for, not when she started, not when she showed the papers, but when she crossed that line, when she added intention, when she made it personal, because that was the part she could not support. Not really. And I finally moved, just a small movement, my hand reaching toward the table, and the sound of my chair shifting slightly was enough to pull every eye back to me. And I looked at her, not angry, not defensive, just steady, and I asked, very calmly, "Are you done?" And the room went quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time, sharper, more focused, and Vanessa hesitated for the first time, just a fraction of a second, before nodding, saying yes, that was everything, and I held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, like I was acknowledging something important, and I said, "Okay," because I needed you to say all of that out loud. And I saw it then, the confusion flicker across her face, small but real, and without rushing, without raising my voice, I reached into my own bag and took out my phone, placing it gently on the table, screen facing up, And I did not look at anyone else. I just looked at her and said, "Then let us go through it together." For a second, no one moved, not even Vanessa, her eyes flickering down to the phone on the table like it was something unfamiliar, something she had not planned for. And I noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the papers she had brought, just enough to crease them, and that was the first crack, small but real. And I did not rush, I did not raise my voice. I simply tapped the screen once and turned it slightly so the people closest could see, and I said, "We should start with your messages, Vanessa. The ones you sent 3 weeks ago. The ones you thought no one else would ever read." And there was a pause, a long one, the kind that stretches just enough to make people lean forward without realizing it. And then I opened the first thread, scrolling slowly, deliberately, not skipping anything, letting each line sit in the air, and I read it out loud, not dramatically, just clearly, her words exactly as she wrote them, about needing to make something look convincing, about how numbers could be rearranged if you presented them the right way, about how no one in the family really understood financial statements anyway. And as each sentence landed, I could feel the room shift again, not all at once, but in small, quiet movements, someone inhaling sharply, someone else straightening in their chair. And I did not look at Vanessa yet. I let the words speak first. I let them build. And then I moved to the next piece, a voice memo, recorded accidentally. Or maybe not. I never asked, but I played it, and her voice filled the room, softer than it was now, almost casual, explaining to someone on the phone how timing would matter, how doing it at a family event would make it impossible for me to defend myself without looking guilty. And that was when I finally looked up, meeting her eyes. And for the first time that night, she looked unsure, not panicked, not yet, but unsure, like she was trying to calculate something that no longer made sense. And Daniel shifted beside me, his hand finally moving, not toward me, not yet, but off the table, like he needed to create distance from what he had just heard. And my father-in-law leaned back slightly, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in focus, like he was reevaluating everything he had just accepted. And I kept going, not fast, not slow, just steady. Because this was not about overwhelming them, it was about clarity, about letting the truth unfold in a way they could not ignore. And I showed the timestamps, the sequence of messages, how the story she had just told lined up perfectly with what she had planned weeks earlier. And then I paused, just for a second, enough to let it settle, enough for the room to catch up. And then I said something very simple. I said, "The documents you brought tonight are not real. They are edited versions of basic account summaries, and I know that because I have the originals." And I opened another file, placing the real statements side by side with what she had presented, highlighting the differences, small at first, then obvious, numbers shifted, dates altered, lines removed, and this time I did look around the room because I needed them to see it, not just hear it, and the reaction was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. A few people leaned closer. One of Daniel's cousins shook his head slowly. My mother-in-law's lips parted slightly, like she was about to say something, but could not find the words, and Vanessa finally spoke, her voice lower now, tighter, saying that this was not what it looked like, that I was twisting things, that I was trying to confuse everyone. And I let her speak. I did not interrupt, because I needed her to keep going, to fill the space with more explanations, more contradictions, and she did. She said the messages were taken out of context, that the recording did not prove anything, that I was trying to manipulate the situation, and I nodded once, like I was considering it, and then I asked her a single question. If that is true, then why did you send this message the night before tonight? And I tapped the screen again, bringing up the final piece, a message sent less than 24 hours ago, where she said everything was ready, that she had the documents, that once she said it out loud, no one would question it. And I read it slowly, word for word. And this time I did not need to look at anyone to know what had changed. I could feel it, the shift in the air, the weight moving, and Vanessa's expression finally broke, just slightly, her eyes darting away for a second before returning. And in that moment, the entire room understood something without needing it explained, and I did not say anything else right away. I let the silence do what it needed to do, because sometimes the absence of words is louder than anything you could add. And when I finally spoke again, my voice was still calm, still steady, and I said you wanted to expose me tonight, but all you really did was show everyone exactly what you planned from the beginning. And this time, no one looked at me with doubt. They were all looking at her. For a moment, no one spoke. And it was not the kind of silence from before when people were waiting for something to happen. This was different, heavier, like the room itself had shifted, and no one quite knew where to stand anymore. Vanessa remained still at the end of the table, her shoulders slightly tense, her eyes no longer moving from person to person the way they had before. Now they stayed fixed on the surface of the table, like she was trying to find something there that would help her regain control. But nothing came, and I noticed how her breathing had changed, just slightly faster, barely visible, but enough to tell me she understood what had just happened. And Daniel finally turned toward me fully, not halfway, not uncertain like before, but completely. And there was something in his expression I had not seen all night. Not anger, not even relief, but clarity, like he was finally seeing the situation without the noise that had been surrounding it. And he asked quietly, "Emily, when did you find all of this?" And I held his gaze for a second before answering, not immediately, because I needed that moment to land. I needed him to understand that this had not been sudden, that this had been building. And I said a few weeks ago, when something did not feel right, and I saw his jaw tighten slightly, not at me, but at the realization of what that meant, that things had been happening around him without his awareness. And my father-in-law leaned forward again, his hands now resting flat on the table, his voice steady but firm as he addressed Vanessa, asking her directly if she wanted to explain the messages, the recording, the documents, and for a brief second, she looked up, her eyes moving quickly across the room, searching, calculating, trying to find someone who might still be on her side. But no one moved, no one spoke, and that was when she tried to speak again, saying that there had been a misunderstanding, that things had been taken out of context, that she had only been trying to protect the family, and her words sounded almost the same as before, but something had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by something thinner, something that did not hold the same weight, and I did not interrupt her. I let her finish, because it was important that everyone heard the difference, that they felt it themselves. And when she stopped, my mother-in-law finally spoke, her voice softer than usual but clear, asking why she would need to create something like this, if there had been no real issue to begin with. And that question stayed in the air longer than any accusation had earlier, because it did not need to be loud to matter. And Vanessa did not answer right away. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, everything became more obvious than any proof could have made it, and I could see it in the way people shifted again. This time away from her, not dramatically, just slightly, chairs moving a fraction of an inch, bodies turning just enough to create distance, and Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. And then he did something I did not expect. He reached for my hand, not quickly, not urgently, but deliberately, like he had made a decision, and his grip was steady, not tight, just present, and that small action said more than anything he could have spoken. And I felt the tension in my chest ease just a little, not completely, but enough to remind me that I was not standing alone anymore. And my father-in-law spoke again, this time more direct, asking Vanessa if she had altered the documents, and she opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, her eyes flickering down to the table, and that silence was the answer, and it was enough. No one needed more, and I watched as the room settled into a new understanding, not loud, not dramatic, but clear. And then something else shifted, something quieter, more internal, because this was not just about what she had done tonight, it was about everything that had led to it. All the small moments, all the subtle comments, all the things that had never quite felt right but had never been proven until now. And I realized that this was the part that mattered most, not the exposure itself, but the recognition, the moment when everyone saw the pattern for what it was, and Vanessa finally stood there without anything left to present, without any control over the narrative she had tried to build, and for the first time since the night began, she did not look like someone leading the room. She looked like someone standing outside of it, and I did not feel the need to say anything else. I did not need to push further or add more, because everything that needed to be seen had already been shown. And sometimes, the strongest position is not the one that speaks the most, but the one that no longer needs to prove anything. and as the silence stretched just a little longer, I realized that the power in the room had shifted completely, not suddenly, but fully, and there was no going back from that. The silence did not break all at once. It loosened slowly, like something tight finally giving way, and the first sound that returned was not a voice but a chair shifting, one of Daniel's cousins leaning back, as if needing space from what had just happened. And then my mother-in-law let out a quiet breath, the kind you do not notice until it has been held for too long. And she looked at me again, really looked this time, not with doubt, not with distance, but with something closer to recognition, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time that night. And I did not say anything. I did not need to, because the room was already moving without me. My father-in-law straightened in his chair and spoke in a tone that left no room for confusion. He said that what had just been shown was serious, that it was not a misunderstanding, and that trust in this family was not something that could be treated lightly. And he did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because the weight of his words settled immediately, and Vanessa finally reacted, not with anger, not yet, but with something sharper, more defensive. She said that everyone was overreacting, that this was being blown out of proportion, that she had only tried to bring attention to something she believed was wrong. And for a moment, it almost sounded convincing again. But the difference now was that no one moved toward her. No one leaned in. No one nodded. And that absence of support was louder than anything else. And Daniel spoke then, his voice steady but lower than usual, asking her directly why she had created false documents, instead of speaking to him privately if she had concerns. And that question landed differently, because it was not just about the act, it was about the intention behind it. And Vanessa hesitated again, her eyes moving briefly toward him, then away, and she said something about not trusting that it would be handled properly, that she felt she had no choice. And I watched the way Daniel's expression shifted at that, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around his eyes, like something inside him had settled into place, and he nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. And then he said quietly that creating a public accusation without verifying the truth was not protecting anyone. And that was the moment I realized something else had changed. This was no longer about me defending myself. This was about the family recognizing what had been done. And my mother-in-law spoke again, her voice more firm now, asking Vanessa why she had never come to her if she truly believed there was an issue. And Vanessa opened her mouth as if to answer, then stopped, and that pause stretched just long enough to confirm what everyone already felt. And I noticed small things then, details that would have gone unnoticed earlier, the way one of the younger relatives avoided looking at Vanessa altogether, the way someone quietly pushed their plate away, appetite gone, the way the energy in the room had shifted from tension to something heavier, something more reflective. And I sat there, still, my hands still in Daniel's, not gripping, just resting, because there was nothing left for me to prove. And that realization settled over me in a quiet way. Not triumphant, not loud, just steady, like something finally aligning after being slightly off for a long time. And Vanessa's voice rose slightly then, not enough to be considered shouting, but enough to break the calm that had settled. She said that everyone was turning against her unfairly, that no one was considering her perspective. And for the first time that night, her composure slipped, just a little, enough to reveal the frustration underneath, and my father-in-law did not respond immediately. He let that moment pass, then said that perspective did not justify fabrication, and that word hung in the air, clear and undeniable, and Vanessa's shoulders dropped slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to show that something in her had shifted, that the control she had walked in with was no longer there. And Daniel released a slow breath beside me, his hand tightening slightly around mine before relaxing again, and he turned to me, his voice softer now, asking if I was okay, and I nodded, because I was, not because the situation had been easy, but because it was over, at least the part that had been hidden. And my mother-in-law looked between us, then back at Vanessa, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before. Disappointment, not loud, not harsh, but present, and it carried more weight than anger ever could. And Vanessa finally looked up again, her eyes moving across the room one more time. But this time there was no search, no calculation, just a quiet realization that the room she had tried to control had moved on without her. and no one needed to say it out loud for it to be understood. And as the evening slowly began to shift back into motion, conversations hesitant at first, then gradually returning, I realized that this was not just the end of a moment. It was the end of something that had been building for a long time, and there was no way to go back to how things had been before, not after everything had been seen so clearly. And I sat there in that quiet awareness, knowing that sometimes the real change does not come from what is said, but from what can no longer be ignored. The conversation did not return to normal. Not really. Even though people started speaking again, their voices were quieter, more careful. Like everyone was aware that something important had just shifted, and they did not want to disturb it. And I could feel it in the way the room moved, slower, more deliberate, like every action now carried a little more weight than before. And Vanessa remained where she was for a few seconds longer than anyone else, standing at the end of the table, her hands no longer holding anything, the papers she had brought now resting untouched in front of her, and then she slowly sat down, not with the same confidence she had stood up with, but with a kind of controlled stillness, like she was trying to hold on to whatever composure she had left, and no one addressed her directly, not immediately. And that absence was noticeable, because earlier the entire room had been focused on her, and now it was as if she had been quietly removed from the center without anyone needing to say it out loud. And I noticed how Daniel did not let go of my hand right away, even as he shifted slightly in his chair, his thumb moving just once across my knuckles in a small, grounding motion, and I realized then how tense he must have been before, how much he had been holding back, and now that tension was easing, not completely, but enough to change the way he sat, the way he breathed, and my father-in-law leaned back again, his posture more settled now, but his expression still serious, like he was processing something deeper than just the moment that had just passed, and after a few seconds, he spoke again, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. He said that this family had always valued honesty and respect, and that what had happened tonight could not be ignored, not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed something that needed to be addressed properly, and no one interrupted him, no one challenged him, because the tone of the room had shifted to match his, and Vanessa did not respond. She kept her eyes on the table, her shoulders slightly drawn in now, and I wondered briefly if this was the first time she had felt that kind of distance from everyone around her, not just disagreement, but a quiet withdrawal, and my mother-in-law reached for her glass of water, taking a small sip before setting it down again, her movements slower than usual, like she was choosing each one carefully, and then she looked at me again, and there was something different in her gaze now, not just acceptance, but a kind of acknowledgement, and she said softly that she was sorry for not asking questions sooner, and that moment caught me slightly off guard, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no attempt to justify anything, just a simple recognition. And I nodded, not because I needed an apology, but because I understood what it meant for her to say it out loud. And Daniel glanced between us, then back at his parents, and I could see something settling in him as well, something quieter, more resolved, and Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair, her hands now folded together, her fingers moving against each other in a small, repetitive motion, and she finally spoke again, but this time her voice was lower, less certain. She said that she did not expect things to go this way, and no one responded right away, not because they were ignoring her, but because there was nothing left to argue about. The facts were already clear, and my father-in-law simply nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what had been said, and then he turned his attention back to the table, signaling without words that the conversation was no longer centered on her, and that shift was more final than anything else that had happened that night, because it was not forced, it was accepted by everyone without resistance, and I sat there quietly, feeling the weight of everything settle into something more stable, not tension, not relief, but clarity. And I realized that this was the part people do not often talk about, the moment after the truth comes out, when everything is still, when the noise has faded, and what remains is understanding. And it is not loud, it does not feel dramatic, it feels calm, almost quiet, but it changes everything. And Daniel finally let out a small breath beside me, one that sounded almost like a release, and he turned slightly toward me, his voice low as he said he should have listened sooner. And I looked at him for a moment, not with frustration, not with blame, but with something steadier. And I said that we both saw it clearly now, and that was enough, because sometimes the most important thing is not who noticed first, but that the truth is finally seen. And around us, the room continued to move, people slowly returning to their conversations, though the tone remained softer, more thoughtful, and I noticed how no one returned to what had happened, as if it were just a small incident. No one laughed it off or dismissed it. Instead, it stayed present in a quieter way, shaping the way everyone interacted for the rest of the evening. And Vanessa remained at the table, but no longer as someone leading the conversation. She had become part of the background, and while no one openly confronted her again, the distance around her was unmistakable. And as I sat there, I realized that what had changed was not just how people saw her, but how they saw everything, the small moments, the subtle signs, the things that had been overlooked before. And now that they had seen them clearly, there was no way to return to not noticing them. And that understanding, quiet as it was, marked the true turning point of the night. The rest of the evening continued, but it never returned to what it had been before, and I could see it in the way people interacted, more intentional, more aware, like everyone was quietly recalibrating how they saw each other. And I stayed seated for a while, not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel that shift fully, to understand it, to let it settle in a way that was real and not rushed. And Daniel eventually stood, his hands still lightly touching mine before he let go, asking if I wanted to step outside for some air, and I nodded, not because I needed to escape, but because I needed a moment where the room was not watching. And we walked through the back door into the cool evening, the air just slightly crisp, the kind that makes you notice your breathing, and for a few seconds we did not say anything. We just stood there, the faint sound of voices still coming from inside, muted now, distant, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, saying he had not known how to react when Vanessa started, that everything had felt too sudden, too public. And I listened, not interrupting, because I could hear the honesty in it, not an excuse, but a reflection. And he said he should have trusted me without hesitation. And I looked at him then, really looked, and I said it was not about reacting perfectly. It was about what he chose to see when it mattered. And he nodded slowly, like that landed somewhere deeper than the words themselves. And for a moment, there was a kind of stillness between us that felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, just clear. And I realized that this was another part of the night I had not expected, not just the exposure, not just the shift in the room, but this quiet space afterward where things could be seen more honestly than they ever had been. And after a few minutes, we went back inside, and the energy had settled into something more structured. People were speaking in smaller groups now, conversations more contained, and I noticed how my mother-in-law approached me first, not hesitantly but with intention, asking if we could talk for a moment. And I agreed, and we stepped slightly away from the table, not out of sight, but into a quieter corner, and she said that she had overlooked too many small signs over time, that she had chosen comfort over questioning, and that tonight had made her realize how easy it was to misjudge someone when you only saw them through the lens of someone else's narrative. And I listened, because this was not something I needed to correct or guide. It was something she needed to arrive at on her own, and when she finished, I simply said that I understood, and that sometimes it takes a moment like this for things to become clear. And she nodded, her expression softer now, and there was a kind of mutual understanding there that had not existed before, not forced, not formal, just present. And when we returned to the table, I noticed Vanessa was no longer sitting with everyone, her chair empty, her place setting untouched, and no one mentioned it, not directly. But the absence was noticed. You could feel it in the way people glanced briefly at the empty seat and then looked away, choosing not to fill that space with words. And my father-in-law spoke with Daniel about something unrelated, a shift back into normal conversation. But even that felt different, more grounded, less performative, and I realized that this was how change actually looks. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, visible in the small ways people choose to act differently after something important has happened. And as the night continued, a few relatives came up to me quietly, not making a scene, just brief conversations, simple acknowledgments, a hand on my shoulder, a few words, nothing exaggerated, but enough to show that they had seen, that they understood, and I accepted each one calmly, not because I needed validation, but because I recognized what it meant for them to approach me that way, and Daniel stayed close beside me, not hovering, not overcompensating, just present. And that presence felt more real than anything he could have said earlier. And as the evening slowly came to an end, people began gathering their things, conversations softening into goodbyes, and I stood near the doorway for a moment, watching the movement, the quiet exchanges, the way the family reassembled itself after being briefly pulled apart, and I realized that nothing would go back to exactly how it was, not for me, not for Daniel, not for anyone in that room, and that was not something to regret. It was something to accept, because sometimes clarity changes things in ways that cannot be undone, and as I stepped outside again to leave, I glanced back once, just briefly, at the house, at the warm light still glowing through the windows, and I thought about how different it had looked just a few hours earlier, how everything had seemed stable, predictable, and now it felt different, not broken, but redefined. And I understood then that what had happened tonight was not just about proving something, it was about revealing something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen, and now that it had been seen, there was no going back to not knowing it. The drive home was quiet, not in a tense way, but in a way that felt unfamiliar, like both of us were still processing everything that had happened, and the streetlights passed one by one across the windshield, casting brief shadows across Daniel's face. And I noticed how his grip on the steering wheel was steady now, not tight like it had been earlier when we first left, and after a few minutes, he spoke again, not looking at me right away, just keeping his eyes on the road, and he said he kept replaying the moment when Vanessa stood up, how quickly everything turned, how easily doubt slipped in before he even realized it, and I listened, letting him say it in his own way, because I knew this was not something that needed to be rushed or corrected, and he admitted that part of him had believed her, not fully, but enough to hesitate, and that hesitation was what stayed with him now, and I did not respond immediately. I just watched the lights move across the dashboard, thinking about how quickly trust can be tested when it is put under pressure in front of other people. And then I said quietly that hesitation is human, but what matters is what you do after you see the truth. And he nodded slowly, like that made sense, like it gave him something to hold on to. And when we pulled into the driveway, the house felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because something inside us had shifted, something that would affect everything moving forward. And as we stepped inside, the silence of the house felt calm, almost grounding after the weight of the evening, and I set my phone down on the kitchen counter, the same place where I had first seen that message weeks ago, and for a moment, I just stood there, looking at it, remembering how uncertain everything had felt back then, how I had not known exactly what I was dealing with, only that something was wrong, and now that uncertainty was gone, replaced by something clearer, more defined, and Daniel came to stand beside me, not saying anything at first, just present, and then he asked if there was anything else I had not told him yet, anything else I had found during those weeks, and I hesitated for a second, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I knew that answering that question would open something else, something that went beyond tonight, and I said there were smaller things, patterns, comments, situations that did not make sense at the time but did now, and he listened without interrupting, and I could see him connecting those pieces, fitting them into a picture that had not been visible to him before, and when I finished, he let out a quiet breath and said he wished he had noticed sooner, and I looked at him and said that sometimes you do not see something clearly until it forces itself into the open, and tonight had done exactly that, and he nodded again, more firmly this time, like he understood that this was not just about the past, it was about what we chose to do next, and we stood there for a moment longer, the kitchen quiet around us, and I realized that even though the situation with Vanessa had reached a kind of conclusion, there were still questions that would need to be addressed, not immediately, not tonight, but eventually, because what had been revealed was not just a single action, it was a pattern, and patterns do not disappear overnight. And later that evening, after everything had settled, after the house had grown completely quiet, I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand, scrolling back through the messages I had saved, not because I needed to review them again, but because I wanted to understand how something like this builds over time, how small actions, small choices, can lead to something much larger when they are left unchallenged. and I noticed details I had not fully paid attention to before: the timing of certain messages, the way certain phrases repeated, the consistency in her approach, and it became clear that this had never been random. It had been intentional from the beginning, and that realization did not make me angry. It made me aware of how important it is to trust your instincts when something feels off, even if you cannot explain it right away. And the next morning, the light coming through the windows felt softer than usual, and the house felt still, like everything had paused for a moment before moving forward again. And Daniel joined me in the kitchen, his expression more settled now, and he said that his parents had called earlier, wanting to talk more about what happened, wanting to understand it fully. And I nodded, because I expected that, because moments like this do not end when the night ends. They continue, they unfold, they reshape relationships in ways that take time to fully understand. And as I stood there, I realized that this was not just about closing a chapter. It was about stepping into a new one where things were no longer hidden, where dynamics had shifted, where clarity had replaced assumption. And that kind of change, while quiet, was powerful, and it was something that would continue to reveal itself in the days ahead. The next few days did not explode into drama the way someone might expect. There were no loud confrontations, no sudden arguments, just a series of quieter moments that carried more weight than anything that had happened at the reunion. And I began to notice how differently people reached out. Not all at once, not in a rush, but one by one, in small, deliberate ways. And the first call came from my father-in-law, his voice calm but more direct than usual, asking if I had time to meet in person, not at the house, but somewhere neutral, and I agreed. And when we met later that afternoon at a small coffee shop about 10 minutes from our place, the kind with soft lighting and the low hum of conversation in the background, he sat across from me with a posture that was both formal and personal at the same time, and he did not waste time with small talk. He said he wanted to understand everything clearly, not just what happened that night, but what led to it, and I appreciated that, because it meant he was not just reacting, he was choosing to look deeper. And I explained what I had seen, how it started with small inconsistencies, how I began saving information, not out of suspicion at first, but out of caution, and how over time it became clear that there was a pattern. And he listened without interrupting, his expression steady, his eyes focused, and when I finished, he nodded slowly and said that what concerned him most was not just the attempt itself, but how easily it could have succeeded if I had not been prepared. And that observation stayed with me, because it was true. If I had not paid attention, if I had ignored those early signs, the outcome could have been very different. And he continued by saying that trust in a family is built on consistency, not assumptions, and that what had been revealed showed a breakdown in that consistency. And I could tell that for him, this was not just about assigning blame. It was about understanding how something like this could happen within his own family. And when we finished, he thanked me, not in a dramatic way, just a simple acknowledgement. And as I left the coffee shop, I felt something shift again, not externally, but internally, like another piece of the situation had settled into place. And later that evening, my mother-in-law called, her voice softer than usual, asking if I could come by. And when I arrived, the house felt quieter than it had at the reunion. The same space, but with a different energy. And she invited me to sit in the living room, the same place where so many conversations had happened before, but this time it felt more intentional, and she spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully, saying that she had been thinking about the past, about moments she had overlooked, about times when she had accepted things without questioning them, and she admitted that she had allowed comfort to shape her perception, that it had been easier to believe everything was fine than to look closer. And I listened, because this was not about correcting her, it was about letting her process what she had come to understand. And she said that she regretted not asking me directly when she first felt something was off, and that she wanted to rebuild that trust moving forward. And I nodded, not because everything was suddenly resolved, but because I could see the effort, the intention behind what she was saying, and those things matter more than immediate perfection. And over the next couple of days, small changes continued to appear. Daniel became more attentive, in subtle ways, not in a way that felt forced, but in a way that showed he was more aware, more present, and conversations between us became more open, not heavier, just clearer, like we were both choosing to address things before they had a chance to build into something larger. And I noticed that I felt different too, not just relieved, but more grounded, like I trusted my own instincts more than before. And that shift was quiet but significant. And then there was Vanessa, who remained mostly absent, not completely gone, but distant, and no one spoke about her directly, at least not in front of me, but her absence was felt in the spaces she used to occupy, and I realized that this was another form of consequence, not loud, not immediate, but real. And one afternoon, as I was organizing a few things at home, I came across the folder where I had saved everything, the messages, the recordings, the documents, and I paused, looking at it for a moment, and I realized I no longer needed to hold on to it the same way, not because it was unimportant, but because its purpose had been fulfilled, and I closed it, setting it aside, and in that simple action, there was a kind of closure, not dramatic, not final, but enough to mark the end of that particular chapter, and as I stood there, I understood something clearly. What happened at the reunion was not just about proving the truth. It was about changing how that truth was seen moving forward, and that kind of change does not happen all at once. It unfolds, it continues, it shapes decisions and relationships in ways that only become fully visible over time, and I was ready for that, ready to move forward with a clearer understanding of everything that had been revealed. About a week after everything settled, I thought the situation had finally reached its natural end, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, steady way things sometimes resolve, when there is nothing left to argue about, and life had begun to return to its normal rhythm. Mornings felt lighter, conversations felt clearer, and there was a sense of space where tension used to sit, and yet something in me remained aware, not anxious, but attentive, like I understood now how easily things could shift if left unexamined. And it was on a late afternoon, when the sunlight was coming through the living room windows at that soft angle that makes everything look still, that my phone buzzed with a message I had not expected. And when I looked down, I saw her name, Vanessa, and for a second I just stared at it, not reacting, not opening it right away, just noticing the feeling that came with it. Not fear, not anger, just curiosity. And after a moment, I opened the message, and it was short, much shorter than I would have imagined. She asked if we could talk, just the two of us, somewhere private, and I read it twice, not because it was unclear, but because I was trying to understand what had changed, what would bring her to reach out like that after everything that had happened, and I did not respond immediately. I set the phone down and walked to the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I thought about it, and Daniel noticed the shift in my expression when he walked in, asking what was wrong, and I showed him the message without saying anything, and he read it quietly, his brow tightening slightly before he looked back at me, and he asked what I wanted to do, and I appreciated that question, because it was not about telling me what I should do, it was about giving me the space to decide, and I said I was not sure yet, not because I was conflicted, but because I wanted to approach it with clarity, not reaction, and he nodded, saying that whatever I chose, he would support it, and that simple statement carried more weight than anything else he could have said, because it showed a shift, a consistency that had been missing before. And later that evening, I sat alone for a while, thinking about the message, not overanalyzing it, just considering what it represented, and I realized that this was another moment of choice, not about proving anything this time, but about how I wanted to move forward. And eventually, I replied, keeping it simple, agreeing to meet, but choosing the place myself, a small cafe not far from where we had met before, somewhere neutral, somewhere quiet. And she responded almost immediately, confirming the time, and when the day came, I arrived a few minutes early, sitting near the window, watching people pass by outside, their movements steady, unaffected by anything that had happened in my life. And that contrast grounded me, reminded me that while this moment mattered, it was still just one part of a much larger picture. And when Vanessa walked in, I recognized her immediately, but there was something different in the way she carried herself. Not dramatically different, but enough to notice, her posture slightly more reserved, her movements more measured, and when she reached the table, she paused for a second before sitting down, like she was choosing her next step carefully. And for a moment, neither of us spoke. Not because we did not know what to say, but because we both understood the weight of the conversation we were about to have. And she finally broke the silence, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it before, saying she knew she owed me an explanation. And I listened, not interrupting, not reacting, just allowing her to speak, because this was not about defending myself anymore. It was about understanding what came next. And she admitted that what she had done had gone too far, that she had let something build inside her over time, something she did not fully address until it became something else entirely. And she did not try to justify it in the same way she had before. She did not argue or deflect. And that difference was noticeable, not because it erased what had happened, but because it showed a shift in how she saw it now. And I watched her as she spoke, noticing the small details, the way her hands rested on the table, still but not rigid, the way her eyes stayed steady instead of searching for reactions. And when she finished, there was a pause, and I realized that this moment was not about deciding whether she was right or wrong, that had already been clear. It was about deciding what, if anything, would come after this. And I took a slow breath before responding, choosing my words carefully, not to control the outcome, but to reflect what I actually felt. And I said that understanding why something happened does not undo it, but it can determine what happens next. And she nodded slightly, like she understood that distinction. And the conversation continued from there. Not tense, not easy, but real. And as we sat there, I realized that this was the final layer of what had started that night. Not the exposure, not the aftermath, but the decision of what to carry forward and what to leave behind. And that kind of clarity does not come from winning or losing. It comes from seeing everything as it is and choosing how to move beyond it. Vanessa listened without interrupting, and that alone told me more than anything she had said so far. Because before, she always had something ready, something to redirect, something to soften the impact of her own actions. But now she stayed still. Her eyes focused on me in a way that felt different, not defensive, not searching for an opening, just present. And after I spoke, there was a quiet pause between us, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning, and she nodded slowly, like she was accepting something she could not change. And she said she understood that what she did had consequences that would not disappear just because she acknowledged them. And I noticed the way her voice stayed even, not trying to sound stronger than she felt. And that honesty, even if it came late, mattered in a different way than anything before. And I asked her one question, not out of curiosity, but because it was the one thing that had stayed with me since that night. I asked why she chose to do it publicly, in front of everyone, instead of addressing it privately, and she looked down for a moment, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. And when she answered, it was not immediate, it came slowly, like she was choosing to be precise. She said that part of her believed that if it was done publicly, it would feel final, that there would be no room for doubt, and that people would accept it without questioning it too deeply. And as she said it, I could hear the logic behind it. Not the justification, but the reasoning that had led her there, and it confirmed something I had already understood. This had never been impulsive. It had been calculated, built over time, shaped by small decisions that eventually led to that moment. And I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because understanding that did not excuse it, but it clarified it. And she continued, saying that somewhere along the way, she stopped questioning whether it was right and focused only on whether it would work. And that was the point where things shifted, not just for her, but for everything that followed. And I could see it now more clearly than before, how intention can narrow perspective, how focusing too much on an outcome can make everything else seem secondary. And when she finished, she looked at me again, not expecting a response, just waiting. And I realized that this was the moment where I needed to be clear, not for her, but for myself. And I said that trust is not something that can be repaired with a single conversation, that it is built through consistency over time, and that what happened had changed how I would move forward, not in a way that closed everything off, but in a way that required distance, at least for now. And she nodded again, this time more firmly, like she had expected that answer. And there was no argument, no attempt to negotiate it, just acceptance. And that was something I had not expected. Not because I thought she would resist, but because acceptance requires a different kind of awareness than what I had seen before. And we sat there for another moment, the conversation settling into something quieter. And then she said something that stayed with me. She said she knew she could not undo what had happened, but she did not want to continue being the same person who made that decision. And I listened, not because I needed to believe it immediately, but because I understood that change, if it was real, would not be proven in words. It would be shown over time, and I told her that actions would matter more than anything said in that moment, and she agreed. And there was a kind of quiet understanding there, not resolution, not closure, but a starting point for something different. And when we both stood to leave, there was no handshake, no formal gesture, just a brief pause, like we both recognized that this was not an ending, but a transition. And as I walked out of the cafe, the air felt cooler than before, not in temperature, but in clarity, like something had been settled internally, even if externally things would still take time. And later that evening, when I returned home, Daniel was in the living room, looking up as I walked in, his expression calm but attentive. And he asked how it went, and I sat down beside him, taking a moment before answering, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted to say it clearly. And I told him that it was not about fixing anything immediately. It was about understanding what had happened and deciding how to move forward. And he listened, his attention steady, and when I finished, he nodded, saying that whatever came next, we would handle it together. And that consistency in his voice, that steadiness, was something I noticed more than the words themselves. And as we sat there, the evening quiet around us, I realized that the most important shift was not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw everything, clearer, more grounded, more aware of what matters and what does not. And that kind of clarity does not come easily. But once it is there, it changes how you move forward in ways that cannot be undone. In the weeks that followed, life did not return to what it had been before, but it became something quieter, something more honest, and I noticed it in the smallest ways, in the way Daniel and I spoke to each other without hesitation, in the way silence between us no longer felt uncertain but steady, in the way I no longer second-guessed my own instincts when something felt off, and there was a kind of calm that settled into our home, not perfect, not untouched by what had happened, but real, grounded in something stronger than before, and the family changed too, not all at once, not in dramatic declarations, but in the way people showed up differently. Conversations became more direct, more intentional, and the unspoken assumptions that once filled the room were replaced with a quiet awareness that truth matters more than comfort. And as for Vanessa, she remained at a distance, not completely gone, but no longer woven into the center of everything. And that distance was not filled with anger, it was filled with clarity, the kind that does not need constant attention to remain. And over time, I realized that what I gained from all of this was not just the relief of being believed. It was something deeper, something that stayed with me long after the moment had passed. It was the understanding that your intuition is not something to ignore, that quiet voice inside you that notices when something is not right. It is there for a reason, and I had almost doubted it at first, almost dismissed it as overthinking, but it turned out to be the very thing that protected me when it mattered most. And that is something I will never overlook again. And I also learned that not everyone who stands close to you is standing with you. And that is not something to fear, it is something to recognize. Because once you see it clearly, you can choose how close you allow someone to stand, and that choice is where your strength is. And if you are listening to this right now, and something in your life feels off, even if you cannot explain it, even if no one else sees it yet, trust yourself enough to pay attention. You do not need to react immediately. You do not need to prove anything right away. But you do need to stay aware, because clarity often comes quietly before it ever becomes visible to others. And protecting yourself is not selfish. It is necessary, whether that means keeping records, setting boundaries, or simply taking a step back to see things more clearly. And healing does not always look like forgiveness or reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like distance, like choosing peace over proximity, like allowing yourself to move forward without needing everything to return to what it once was. And there is a kind of freedom in that, a kind of quiet strength that does not need to be announced. And through all of this, I found myself leaning more into something I had not paid enough attention to before, a sense of faith, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet belief that truth has a way of revealing itself, that what is meant to be seen will eventually come into the light. whether you force it or not. And that gave me a kind of peace I had not felt before, because it reminded me that I do not have to control everything. I just have to stay grounded in who I am. And as I look back now, I do not see that night as the moment everything fell apart. I see it as the moment everything became clear, the moment when illusion gave way to truth, when silence gave way to understanding, and when I stopped allowing others to define my place in the room and started standing in it fully, without hesitation. And if you have stayed with me through this story, thank you truly, because stories like this are not just about what happened, they are about what we carry forward. And I hope that something in this helped you feel a little less alone, a little more seen, and maybe even a little more certain about your own strength. And if it did, you can share where you are listening from and what time it is for you, because I always find it meaningful to know where these stories reach. And if this story stayed with you, you can follow along for more, only if it feels right for you. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never ignore the quiet truth inside you, because it may be the very thing that saves you.